So let me just move on now to the session. So we're going to get Chris talking about global sourcing in the new world. He's going to be talking about some of the learnings we have from our sourcing team. And myself and Phil are going to talk about rethinking transformation, some of the change things that we've been learning about. And then finally, some of our program managers, Ian, Terry and Colin, are going to talk about some of the learnings in program management. So I'll move us on very quickly. First of all, we'll talk about this global sourcing and what we've learned in the last 15 months. And I think some of the key subjects that have been coming up are IR35 and what the impact on sourcing is from the changes in IR35. A little bit about global sourcing strategies and are they still working, and what's been happening on the global sourcing market. And then we're going to talk about one company's approach to developing employees and training that they've come up with to kind of think about sourcing. So can I welcome Chris Halwood? Hi, Chris.
Hi, Gillian.
If you want to talk us through, I know we did this little bit of pestle analysis. What came out of some of the things that from our team about what's happening over the last 15 months?
Well, the first thing to say, Gillian, is a lot. There is a lot been happening over the last 15 months or so, and just rattling through a few of those things on the slide to give us a flavour. And these are all things that do impact on people's thinking about global sourcing. So the very obvious one was Brexit, and I think still people are really trying to get to grips with the fallout from Brexit. We still hear every day on the radio that people are trying to wrestle with, I think, the uncertainty that Brexit has caused. One of the other big, I think, global and political issues is this rumbling debate around globalization and anti-globalization, which I think is being fueled by a growing level of nationalism that is being seen across the world in lots of different countries. So on the political front, I think there's lots of things that are giving people pause for thought. And we talk about global sourcing, and of course the whole notion of global sourcing is that you're using resources from across the globe. So any concerns that people have about working on that global stage is going to cause organisations to think about whether that's the right thing for them. So we'll come back to this theme in the next 15 minutes, I think. The impact of COVID is enormous. And again, we're not entirely sure as to how that's going to play out, but there's been a lot of money that has been borrowed by a lot of organisations and countries as well. And that is going to give them pause for thought. My sense of it would be that many of them will need to dip into the global sourcing pool in order to continue to support their goals and objectives, because they won't actually have the funds internally to fund it themselves. So we also have this whole notion around the social changes that have taken place, particularly post-COVID. Working from home is a big one, and I think that again has impacted the way that sourcing works. Technology rumbles on, and I think at an ever-growing pace of change. So we see that there's most organisations at least exploring digitalisation, and many of them actually looking to develop their digital capability. But we also have AI, artificial intelligence, as an important agenda item for many organisations who feel that they need to be exploring that to maintain their competitiveness. And underpinning that is this whole concern around cybersecurity, a major issue that has created some tensions between wanting to get into digitalisation and developing technological capability, but also having to deal with the weaknesses that can create in your organisation. There's some legal stuff that's been going on. You mentioned IR35, and we'll touch on that a little more in a moment. There's also changes in the way that regulators have been looking at outsourcing. And a couple of the key ones was EBA, the European Banking Authority, introduced some guidelines back in 2019, which in fact are due to hit a deadline at the end of this year, 31st of December 21. So a number of organisations in that particular arena are having to run around and sort out what they need to sort out. The PRA, the Prudential Regulatory Authority, have also issued some supervisory statements in order to be aligned with that EBA stuff, but also to add a few more requirements themselves. So there's a deadline for that, the end of first quarter in 2022. And then, of course, there's our old favourite of the environment. The green agenda, sustainable procurement is a major issue for many organisations. And environmental, social and governance, this ESG, which if you're looking through your various bulletin boards and news feeds, you may well see that pop up quite a lot. So when I say there's been a lot going on, there's a lot going on.
Yep. And I think there's a couple of things you're going to focus on. So you were going to kind of just do a quick recap on IR35 and just talk about what we're seeing in the market. So, what are the key themes that have come out?
Yeah, I think that the IR35, when it's without getting into the weeds on this one, but essentially it's the Inland Revenue who have looked at how people were conforming with the previous rules on IR35 and feeling that most people that should have been IR35'd actually weren't. So they've tightened the rules, and in particular, they require now medium to large-sized organisations to make the estimation as to whether their contractors should be working in or out of IR35. So there's a greater onus, I think, to try and demonstrate if you are an individual contractor that you don't fall within IR35, and collaborations and businesses like ASCEA, I think, will help freelancers and contractors to deal with some of the issues around being caught by IR35. If you go on to the next slide, we can see that there's a couple of things particularly that flow from it. And one of the things that can happen is that contractors can work within IR35, but of course that means that their tax bills increase significantly. And many, I speak to only a couple today, who really aren't too keen to do that. So choose to typically become an employee of the organisation, or they have to work for organisations like ASCEA in order to look to try and avoid the impact of IR35. What I think it does is to reduce the flexibility of the workforce. And one of the things that I think the list on our pestle analysis shows us is that if organisations are going to prosper, flexibility and adaptability are the critical capabilities they need to have. I'd almost say that you don't need to necessarily be strong, you need to be adaptable, and it's that will be absolutely key. In that regard as well, it occurred to me that we have IR35 on the one hand, which is reducing flexibility in the workforce potentially. But what we also have is this notion of open talent platforms, which, speaking to a number of people, it's perhaps passing some people by that we now have a $2 billion industry of freelancers and contractors working through these platforms, which are significant sized organisations in themselves. And more organisations are now starting to wonder whether they need managed services companies in quite the same way as they did in the past, but rather they could go onto these platforms and recruit the required resources, whether that be people to do some of your development work or indeed program management work. But of course, there are issues around organisations' capabilities to manage that process of recruiting your own skills.
And I think one of the things that brings to my mind, Chris, is the fact that I know there are some people from other countries on. I think these kind of discussions are going on with the kind of growth of nationalism about how to make sure we secure funds for the revenue in the countries, because I think everybody's been struggling a little bit at the moment.
I think that's absolutely right.
And I think one of the other things that brings us on to is this whole global picture, what's happening to global sourcing strategies, and with growth, are they still working?
For sure, and you know, as we picked out a little quote from Deloitte that says that information technology has been an important activity area for a very long time, and in fact, in terms of outsourcing, it is still by far the biggest type of outsourcing that is undertaken across the globe. But in the aftermath of the pandemic, organisations saw that technology has taken on a much greater importance still. And you only have to look at the share prices of technology firms to see that it is powering forward in lots of different ways. But then, so now we've got this tension between technology being really important, but in terms of global sourcing strategies, then there are some concerns that organisations have. So if you go to the next slide.
And just before I go to the next slide, Chris, on the open talent platforms, we had a question come in about, do open talent platforms provide any of the liability insurances they need?
Yeah, I think it rather depends on which talent platforms you're a member of, and that will be part of their business proposition. Some of them certainly will provide some levels of liability, and there's useful contractual arrangements that are built into the operation of these platforms. So there's certainly something that people should look to explore. So those organisations like freelancer.com and Upwork, Topcoder, these are all the types of open talent platforms that you should have a look at.
Excellent, thanks, Chris. So I'll move you on to the next slide. That was a great answer.
So we mentioned about the pandemic and anti-globalization has been really challenging the offshore strategy. For many years, people have questioned whether, in fact, you should be, as they would, the politicians for sure would describe it, outsource jobs to other countries. It's been a big political football in America for sure, and still remains. So there's always been some concerns about far shoring in particular, and I think that's been given a sharper focus through the pandemic, when people were clearly concerned about having operations in far off distant places when the pandemic was going forward. I think some of them coped remarkably well, and India was a good example. They've had some real challenges as far as the pandemic's concerned, and I don't hear of huge problems that have been created as a result of that. The providers have had to work really hard to re-establish their resources so that they can still deliver to their clients. But I think going forward, it's clearly going to be the case that certain aspects of the contract will need to be really thought about. So cybersecurity, the green agenda, supplier diversity, business continuity through the pandemic was shown up to be woefully poor in many instances. And I think you'll find that in contracting going forward, that will be an area that people will be shining a light on. And governance as well. Governance, my concern is that through the pandemic, a lot of organisations will have had to have essentially just circumvented a lot of governance procedures and protocols just to try and stay afloat. And I think what a lot of the lawyers are saying is, I hope somebody wrote something down whilst we were making all of these adjustments to the contracts on the fly. So I think there's some real arguments for perhaps retrenching your sourcing and taking things back in-house. But I do think we have to remind ourselves of what the argument is for using external third parties. So Richard Cribb helpfully wrote a book, love him and bless him. So he wrote a book, and those were the various areas that he included in his book. And it was all about really thinking, why is it that we bother to do global sourcing in the first place? And of course, the reason is that we have this talent pool from across the globe. So the logic, I think, is rather persuasive. The bigger the talent pool that you can draw from, then the greater the opportunity you have to identify the capabilities you need. So those organisations that are spreading their net far and wide are the ones most likely to find the best deals at the lowest price, the greatest levels of innovation, getting capacity, access to resource, and so on. So I think it's quite a powerful argument for considering global sourcing as still a very current strategy. What I think it does mean, though, this is where we go to the next slide, it does mean that we need to get better at doing it. So we need to be thinking really about improving the capabilities of our in-house resource, and in-house IT resource as well, to manage the relationships that we create. So we may well still see that there is a need to have in-house resource, but I think the argument for having external resource to supplement and complement that is important. What we need to do is to make sure that organisations develop their teams, develop their people, which is my particular focus. So those were some of the things that we lighted upon, and that's not an exhaustive list. So if you just go to the next slide, Jill, the approach that I've always advocated is really to focus on the key areas in terms of skills, so management and people, technical and strategy and leadership. And I think that hasn't really changed over the last couple of years. In fact, it hasn't changed for a long time. But what we now need to think about is how we can address those capability, those training needs in a more practical and efficient way. We need to make sure that we are dealing with the issues of not being able to do things face to face, of being able to introduce new training but ramp it up at scale. So I think what it's done, and that's what my business RQV and ASCEA have really focused on over the last 18 months or so, is developing a remote capability to deliver training, training and development. The critical thing to understand, I think, though, is for it to be effective, training strategies need to be founded on delivering core knowledge, those fundamentals that we need to know. But where we really start to see an impact on performance of our organisations is when we can get people to translate that knowledge into experience, actually on the job experience. And as we develop in our careers, what that experience translates into is insight. So I think in the short term, it is difficult to get insight and experience in place in your organisations, but it is entirely achievable to deliver the knowledge. I think it's what we saw was that the relationship that exists between RQV Learning and ASCEA is that we saw that experience was the shared value. We saw that our knowledge programs needed to be translated into experience and insight, but recognised that with a lot of our clients, they needed experience and insight now, not in 6 months, in 6 years' time. And I think it's then that you start looking at trying to bring in external advisors like ASCEA to supplement the teams that you have. And also, I think we forget that if you get a good team of consultants, they will actually help to develop your own teams by sharing their experience and their insights.
And I'm conscious that we're going to move on to the next piece, but anybody got any questions they want to ask? from what they've heard about sourcing strategies. Any comments from the rest of the team before I move us on?
I was just going to come in on training strategy, which will be coming up again soon. And I'd echo your point, Chris, about ultimately, when we talk about transformation things, we're talking about the capabilities of people. And as you say, it's the important thing with a training strategy point of view is what translates into action. And as you say, into experience and then insight. And the way organisations are going about that is an area that still needs plenty of work. I'll expand this theme again in a little while, right? But the point about training strategy, I think, very well made.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, I was just talking to a big organisation today, and they recognise the need to have ways in which they can develop core knowledge programs. But we're really excited about the prospect of trying to structure people's learning on the job. That was for them the key takeaway, that they needed people to be able to understand what they were learning as they were doing the role, and trying to bottle it, really, trying to capture it, because a lot of it we pick it up and we don't even realise it, and of course that's not the most efficient way of doing it. So for me, really important.
Excellent. I'll move us on then to the next topic area, which was all about rethinking transformation. And I think some great points come out there. So I'm going to just do a bit of an introduction to it, and then Phil's going to pick up and continue the discussion. So the insights I came up with, and I've been working with several organisations over the last 12 months. I seem to have spent all of the last 12 months in this room, moved out of it. I'm looking forward to a face-to-face meeting next week. But I think the organisations I've been working with have been rethinking their change agenda. They've got lots of activities they were doing before the COVID struck, and they've now been thinking, okay, we've put a lot of those on hold. What are we doing next? What do we need to move on to? So what's going to happen? A lot of them are talking about really, really being worried about the pressure that's going to put on their people as they change. One or two of them are looking at new organisation designs, new structures, because they've put some very interim structures in place during COVID. And they've been kind of thinking about how do we manage today's work? And from what they've learned from that, they want to put a more permanent structure in. And at least two organisations I've worked with are looking at matrix structures where they get people working together in different ways. All of the organisations I've spoken to in the last few months have said they're going to continue some level of hybrid working. I think there's only one organisation I've actually seen come up, that's actually come up and have actually said to me that they want people back in work. But all the ones I've been working with have said, no, there's some level of hybrid working going to continue. But what does that mean to the culture in those organisations? What does that mean for how people work together? And I think this piece on learning that's been coming up, there's definitely something there about how do we get people to learn, because so many organisations were doing on-the-job learning and a few courses. So what does that mean? A number of people I've worked with are looking at mental health and well-being as a priority. And then there's been a lot of concerns about change rising, because they're starting up the old change projects. They're starting up projects about how do we work together in the new hybrid working. They're starting projects on organisation design. And Bill will also talk about technology, and there's definitely people changing some of their technologies. I think technology's moved a long way during COVID. So, ensuring people are prepared for the future is absolutely essential. So I'm going to hand over to Phil. So I'm going to stop sharing. Phil, you can share slides, but I will look to see if I can make you a co-host as well. Not sure whether that's activated, but you can definitely share the slides.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Jill. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Lovely to see you all. Can I start with a question? We perhaps better make this a rhetorical question. This is 2021. So what is the definition today of being old? Yeah. What is it that defines whether or not we are old? I've got the answer. It's whether or not you use the word digital. Because with the amount of technology that we've got, one of the things that marks out the immigrants from the natives is this single word, and the natives don't use it. They just talk about what is, the stuff that is happening, the technology that's already being used. Whereas old folk is, dare I say it, like me, not of course the rest of you. Okay, we'll use the word digital to illustrate things and to talk about some of the technology that is being introduced and that we are enjoying. So let's consider now, under this whole heading of transformation, some of the impact of technology, but particularly the impact from a human perspective, and whether our skills are keeping pace with things. And in discussing this, here is a picture of a technological threat. You'll have to rely on me to tell you about this. I'm sure none of the rest of you are old enough to recognize a Burroughs TC500, the provenance of which I believe goes back to the early 1970s. It actually predates my own earlier career in banking, and this was used as a processing tool then. This advert for the venerable Burroughs TC500 says a lot about the technological threat as it was seen at the time. What this was doing was marking the transformation of handling information from the handwritten age, which was working up until the 1960s, I understand, and into the 1970s, where you'd got the machine age and machinery handling information and various parts of basic data input. One of the reasons that I share this with you, though, is what I was told was the way this machine was received at the time. It was received with a degree of skepticism. It was thought and feared that it would cause fewer jobs. It was not universally greeted as being progress. And as such, it was a piece of technology, on the one hand, quite impressive, but similarly also seen, as I say, as a threat. Yet, within a matter of a few years, newer models came on board. It was seen to be the norm. And of course, this was as well, within a period of about 10 years, seen to be actually rather old hat in terms of technology. In other words, the reception that this got initially was very skeptical, but we soon got used to it. How are we coping with technology at the moment, therefore? Well, we've not been doing too bad. Compared to the Burroughs TC500, the technology that we have available to us today is, of course, some light years ahead. And if I stick with the retail banking analogy, I think a good example of this is a personal favorite of mine. I will confess I'm a customer, and that's Monzo. If any of you are using Monzo, I presume you're enjoying it, but certainly my initial impressions, the whole setup and ease of use of it put the existing banking incumbents in the shade. I know they're all making improvements to their apps and the online banking experience. And of course, you've got way more technology available now through your smartphone and even just through your Monzo app than was provided by the Burroughs TC500 some 50 or so years ago. So we've got a phenomenal amount of change. Yet what's important about how this change takes place is not just what the technology is or even what the technology does. What's becoming important is the human response to this and how we look to take this technology on board and how we look to develop with it. And with that in mind, I think one of the questions is, how well are we adapting to new environments and adapting to technological change? And indeed, the question of how well we as people are adapting to transformation is very, very current. If I look at today's article, this was published at 12 o'clock today by People Management. People Management magazine is the in-house magazine of the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. I do have a vested interest here. I'm the chair of the Coventry and Warwickshire branch of the CIPD. And as the professional body of the HR profession, they're very much in the forefront of looking at better work and better working lives. And the report issued today is 3 in 5 adults don't have the right skills for the next 5 years. This research coming from City and Guilds, as it happens, but highlighting that even people with degrees, and of course a huge number of people now are leaving the education system with a degree, many more than was the case 10, 20 years ago. But they're finding that the amount of relevance that a degree has to the workplace, only about 1 in 5 people with a degree found that that was going to be relevant, or even that the skills level you get with a degree is going to be relevant to the workplace. So what can be done and what does need to be considered in terms of developing people for the future? And especially bearing in mind some of the technological challenges that go with this. So let me share with you a model which I've used for many years, which I believe gives us some clue about skills development, but also what else is involved and is important. And this ties in, I think, very neatly with what Chris was already saying about training strategy. The model that I use when evaluating training requirements, but indeed human requirements, is called CASH. This is just a very high level tool, but I believe gives us a clue about what we've got to think about in terms of how we need to develop. Let me take you through this. The K is about knowledge, and as Chris already mentioned, knowledge development, whether this is through training or through other methods of acquiring knowledge, is one form of development. Of course, there's no shortage of knowledge these days. All right, we can easily get hold of it and Google it quite readily. There is, of course, the question about whether we've got sufficient knowledge to know whether what Google tells us really is the case, because there's so much information out there. Sometimes one of the issues is sorting out the relevance of that information, and indeed the accuracy of that information. So we need a degree of knowledge and a degree of, if you like, education to be able to handle the amount of knowledge we've got. But I don't believe knowledge on its own is going to be the answer. It's also the attitude. And this is, I think, in terms of our attitude to our own development, our attitude to learning. And if any of you, like me, have got teenage children, you will be aware that one of the things that's talked about very much in the wake of the pandemic is attitude to learning. I know my daughter, when she finished her studies last year, one of the things we looked at on the school report is about attitude to learning. Why don't we mark adults on that as well? All right, if it's good enough for the kids, why don't we talk about adults on this? because bearing in mind what I've said on that CIPD report, that many adult skills aren't sufficient for the next 5 years. One of the drivers for that is going to be people's willingness to learn. What helps that is making learning and training available. You can get any knowledge you like either in a book. Sorry, I'm rather old school, so I've even read some of these. Okay, you can get them on books or on computer screens. That's not the issue. The issue is about the desire to want to look at these things, to either read the books or research what you can on your screens, whether that's online learning courses through the likes of, say, Udemy, Coursera, or other online platforms. There's many available. But one of the key things with these MOOCs, as they are called, all right, the online courses, most of them, the vast majority, some of the numbers I'm reading are up into the 90% of them, are started but not completed. That says something about attitude. If you get the attitude right, then we talk about skills, how good you get at things. All right, how good you get at things. What skills are going to be needed? In terms of coping with technology, we're probably not all going to need to be able to code like Zuckerberg. Just like many of us have got our cars but actually won't look under the bonnet, or would be scared of looking under the bonnet, but we have got sufficient skills to be able to drive one particularly. So it is with the hardware that we're using, and indeed some of the software that we use. You need the ability to be able to use it and take messages on board. You don't always need the opportunity and capability to be able to fix it. But we can ask about what skills are going to be required. And under the skills heading, the kind of areas which I look at are whether we're developing what I call hard skills. This might be about understanding technology. I also train in helping people understand finance, which some people certainly call a hard skill, and similarly business strategy and business planning, versus the softer skills. These are the more human communication related skills. For example, in terms of presentation, I was training people this week on pitching for finance, or helping small businesses pitch for finance. The big difference there being, of course, over the last 15 months, they're not having to actually physically turn up anywhere. They've got to make their pitch through the webcam, and have to adapt their skills accordingly. And the H, yeah, this is arguably the piece of the jigsaw puzzle that connects the other three. It could also be said to be one of the outcomes of developing knowledge, developing your attitude, and developing your skills. But it's certainly one of the things that's going to help Chris' previous point about training strategy and getting training into practice. It's our habits. What are our new working habits? And as Jill was mentioning, we could be right now in the very vanguard of developing new working habits, with new hybrid models being worked out pretty much as we speak. Actually, I'm joining another CIPD call tomorrow lunchtime, which is going to be sharing ideas about different hybrid and virtual working models. And we're doing that on a call, which is very much establishing the fact there's no one size that fits all on this, but exploring how different models are working in different kinds of business. And these are going to take on different working habits. We've taken on not just working from home over the last 15 months, WFH, but WFA. In other words, looking much more at here at working from anywhere. If you like, agile working and developing agile working practices. Consequently, I think there's some key questions for us to consider here. That we know there is a huge amount of technological change still to come. Some of this technological change we can see coming down the road in terms of, for example, electric vehicles and technology assisting the driving. I think the driverless technology may still be some way down the road. But also there's a huge amount of technological change which is not yet known about or not yet understood. Certainly the impact would not be understood. So with that in mind, here's a question. What cash do you think most needs developing in 2021? In other words, the next 6 months. What sort of cash, knowledge, attitude, skills and habits do you think most needs developing over the next year to help us for the future? Jill, I think at this point, this is where I was going to suggest we use, say, 2 or 3 breakout rooms and put people into breakouts for literally 5 minutes just to consider this and see what comes out. Yeah. And given the numbers of us, actually probably 3 breakout rooms might work better. Yeah. And the question is, what cash, knowledge, attitude, skills and habits do you think most needs developing in 2021? Jill, could you put us into some breakouts?
So I'm just going to do a 5-minute breakout room starting now. So I don't know who's going to end up in which room. So hopefully there'll be some people you know and don't know in those rooms. So I'll see you all on the other side.
Sorry, the thing I forgot to say before giving you 5 minutes in breakout room is that 5 minutes is in no way going to be enough time as well. So, you know, it was only high level. And Karen, I know you got cut off in a really important point there, but just take some feedback. I think I was in breakout room 4 and Jill, I'm not sure who was in breakout room number 1.
No, I'm not. I think I joined 2. Was Chris, were you in?
That was Colin. That was Colin and myself in breakout 1.
Excellent. What very quickly, Terry, and indeed Colin, and anyone else in breakout room 1, what did you highlight that needs to be developing?
It was an interesting conversation. We had different perspectives on it. Colin's perspective, and Colin, jump in if I've understood this either right or wrong. Basically, that we have to develop all of those skills, but predominantly learning how to work better remotely through these sorts of things as we move forward, because that's going to become more of the norm. And also considering new people coming into the workplace that have not gone through this transition period. How are they going to work into the current needing the right skills, the right attitudes to move into the modern, whatever that norm's going to look like. Colin, did I summarize your bit okay? And I'm sorry, I missed the other lady's point. I'm looking for a name desperately.
It's Fiona. No, it was perfect.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Jill and someone else was in room number 2.
Yeah, so myself and Chris were in room number 2. We've got a bit carried away with what does it mean? How are we going to build that camaraderie and a team? How do we get the attitudes of team working back properly when this happens? Talked a little bit about how do we get the feel back of being in an office where we share insights and ideas around the office. So very often you learn about a change happening when some colleague comes up to you and goes, did you know they're doing that? And that water cooler, coffee machine, cafe, whatever it is, conversation, where you start to really understand the impacts of any change that's happening on you and the team. So those are some of the things we talked about.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Jill, I think I was in room 4, was I? Did we have room 3 as well?
We did have a room 3. I don't know who was in that room. Anybody want to go off mute and shout up?
Hi, Jill. It's Ian. I was in room 3. I can summarise the points, I think. I think what we said is experience of home working is probably different between a large organisation and a small organisation. Some have had good experiences and others not. And what came through also was that, you know, it's in some cases it's quite easy to move to a home working scenario, but if you're in a large organisation, then sometimes the processes and protocols don't make that easy, and, you know, can make it actually really difficult to have any sort of personal engagement with the organisation. And but equally, you know, we had evidence that if you're in a small organisation, actually maybe you're nimble enough and don't have the same sort of challenges to be able to sort of to make that work much easier.
Yeah.
So I think they were the sort of the key themes, really.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Ian, and room 3. I was in room 4 with Shrija, Elias, and Kerin. And Kerin, we got cut off. You were making, I think, really important point at the end. Would you like to add something?
You're putting me on the spot. I can't remember what I'm saying.
Oh, right. Okay.
No, we were talking about, you know, how it all basically to build skills and capabilities. There's got to be a cash injection. It's got to be a comprehensive view of how you do this, and probably less ad hoc and reactive and more proactive and planned.
Yeah. All right. Good point. And as look, we had a great discussion in room 4 as well in different areas, and Shree was making the case for improvements in technological skills amongst other things as well. And look, in these discussions, and particularly in the time we have this afternoon, what I was attempting to do is get us thinking about some of the issues, and maybe only just, you know, touching on some of the potential answers. I think the overall point is that when we're talking about transformation, and if we're talking about getting different results, we can't get away from the fact that whatever technology we have and whatever technological challenges there may be, ultimately that change is going to be driven by people behaving differently and doing different things. We have to be flexible and adaptable, and if nothing over the last 15 months, we've all proved we can be flexible and adaptable. I think those are likely to continue, but there'll be ongoing behavioral changes. Using knowledge, attitude, skills and habits is a way of doing that, and that amidst all of the change, the one constant will be that it will come through the change in people. Very happy to continue discussion some other time or consider questions, but I know we've got some other stuff coming up as well. So Jill, back to you.
Excellent. I will head us over to the programme management piece. So I'll share my screen again, and I'll get Ian and Terry and Colin to give us some input from that. And then hopefully there's some time at the end for us just to quickly kind of share any additional thoughts. So let me just share my screen, and it's over to you guys. Oops. I've ended up going back to where I was. Sorry about this, folks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ian.
All right, Jill. If you can just pop onto the next slide, please. Yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, so hello, everyone. My name's Ian Hucker. I'm just going to talk you through 2 or 3 slides really on program management and project management, I guess, and also think about what the pandemic has meant for delivery. And so I'm going to talk this through. And I started off thinking about asking, when I thought about this subject, I started to think along the lines about, well, what has actually changed? And I was sort of thinking about the history of working, and then, or my career in particular. And, you know, I remember sort of like 40 years up, you know, the way we communicated was with a typist and a man in a van taking, you know, communications around. And I thought that's amazing from where we are today, from where we've come from. And then 30 years ago, you know, some of us had probably just unpacked a first PC, but, you know, we were operating on big sort of mainframes and probably just getting around the rudimentaries of some of the real basic software applications, you know, the word processing and spreadsheets and the like. And then, you know, 20 years ago, I guess, you know, the internet's really pushing on. We see a real push in the market around, you know, outsourcing. You know, a lot of big change was being delivered, starting to be delivered by on a global footing by partners and suppliers all around the world. And then of course, in the last sort of 10 years, everything is sort of really pushed off with the, you know, the internet and the technology being exploited on that platform around the Internet of Things, you know, from large companies, the cloud technology, and open source computing. And then when I thought about that in the context of program management, I thought, well, actually, it's technology that has largely driven all of that change. And I think in part we've, you know, I guess people's experiences will be different, but yeah, from where I sit, I think, you know, companies have largely kept working, or the good ones especially, or the critical ones, have largely kept working on that foundation of technology. And we've all had our risks and, you know, struggles and challenges, but they've all managed to keep going and keep the lights on. I think that is when you put that back into a sort of what program management is about, it's all about delivering that change over that period of time. I think that's really is quite remarkable. And then I thought, well, so what then? So, you know, this is another risk that's hit programs. How do we manage that? What's different about this? And then I thought, really, what is different, I think, is that this all happened at once. You know, normally you identify your risk and you try your best to mitigate and put the measures in place to manage them. But with a pandemic, you know, the risk is that at that national enterprise level, it's almost impossible for programs to really think through what some of these things that might have come in left field would do to them, and how they would manage those risks, and how they will keep on track. So I think, you know, the fact that, you know, the pandemic hit everybody at the same time, all these programs and all this, you know, inertia of work to try and run around and keep the lights on and keep businesses operating, is quite staggering. I think maybe, you know, in the fullness of time, we'll look back and it'd be quite impressive about how we did that. And of course, we've done that on a global context as well, because a lot of companies rely. Well, you know, you can ask yourself the question about, you know, how do we all rely on services that are provided, you know, outside of the UK? So we really are operating on sort of a global footing these days. And of course, the pandemic has come at different times for different parts of the world, and so that has placed different challenges on programs as we deliver change. But that took me to thinking about where the impacts were on programs, and I suppose the temptation is to think it's all centered around an in-flight program. So there's that immediacy of firefighting and keeping the lights on and doing everything you can to keep things on track, which is what generally good delivery people do. And of course, that is no short challenge when you think of the sudden changes to the ways of working that would bring. But it's not the only thing, of course. You know, there's that immediacy about dealing with, you know, the firefighting, but but there's also about, well, once I've reacted to this, you know, how do I then, what's the resilience of my program? What's the assessment? How am I going to continue to do this? And am I delivering the right thing? You know, the world suddenly changed overnight. Are we going down the right direction? You know, is my scope correct? What is the impact on the business case? You know, these fundamental questions will take a little time. You know, once the firefighting's died down, there's that reflection, you know, still in the sort of fairly immediacy and short term. But the question is, you know, I'm now starting to question whether or not the change that we're, you know, embarking on is the right one, and does there need to be a bit of reflection and refocus to ensure that the investment is in the right thing. And then thirdly, there's this bit about recovery and redirection. So, you know, once we've sort of come out of the dark, as it were, and we understand, you know, how maybe our different partners and suppliers need to work, how our own people need to work, what the issues and challenges are around the technology around home working. You know, how do we bed that into a revised project plan and program plan that actually stacks up and we'd have some degree of confidence in? There's that little bit of time where you need some you know, water under the bridge to really know and understand what it is you need to do, and whether these things are enablers to being able to deliver a program of work effectively. And then I guess maybe moving into the sort of, you know, short to middle term, and I say short to middle term because I think that's probably right, is you know, we talk about adapting to the new norm now as if it's something that's going to happen, but we don't quite know what that is yet. You know, we don't really know what the impact is for people, processes, and systems. You know, and whether the selection, you know, the projects we have in the investment plan at the moment will be the right ones, or will they need to change, and what do they need to change to? And one of those things that I suspect will need to change is likely to be the role of the skills needed between the program manager and project leader, because working in a more disparate remote working scenario is going to test the abilities and skills of those managers to actually sort of understand in a different way that these programs are on track. And of course there's a whole sort of people agenda and well-being agenda that needs to be, you know, plugged into that, in terms of how do you know if you're not having the opportunity to if you like have those offline conversations with your teams and with your stakeholders, you know, how are you going to get the feel good factor that everything is not just you're not getting the assurance that everything is on track, but you're comfortable that you know, people are well, people are happy and in what they're doing, and that there aren't issues going on under the surface, of which I'm sure all of us have asked those questions of ourselves over the last 18 months. So I think, you know, those 4 stages really sort of, you know, broaden out the thought of program management and make you think across the broader breadth of it. Jill, could you move me to the next slide, please? Thanks. So this is, if you like, some lessons that have sort of pulled together from a variety of sources, but I think these are the common threads that come out, really. So I'd be interested on your thoughts on them. And the feel is that, you know, if you have organizations that have good, solid structures, a very strong delivery discipline, and the right governance controls in place that are well defined, then these programs sitting in those types of organizations do better than others. And conversely to that, you know, if you are working in an organization that is that doesn't have that in place, then chances are that things will become more difficult. And they won't just become more difficult for a delivery manager. They become more difficult for the stakeholders, the exec, whoever is operating, who is part of that overall component of the program. So that is really the sort of the learning taken off from so far on that. The second point on the importance of project leadership, that really, again, builds on from the first, but it's really about having sort of clear accountabilities and clarity of purpose, and also, you know, I mentioned about the exec and stakeholders, but it's about also having those that guidance and time and assurance that you are doing the right things and you're clear of where your delineation and accountabilities are, because these, you know, decisions are obviously being made sort of you know, quickly and not necessarily in the way that they would normally take effect. Effective stakeholder management. There's been a raft of collaboration type tools that have been used successfully in the main to help that engagement, and I think we're likely to see more of that. So, you know, of course, you know, moving from an office-bound situation, you have more of that time with stakeholders outside of the formal meeting. So it's probably quite easy to continue with the sort of governance and the structure of meetings and have those formal sessions. But what programs really lack is that opportunity to talk to your key people, sponsors, stakeholders, and teams offline, getting that time which you probably, and discussion about, you probably wouldn't have in a formal meeting, and that ability to build up that sort of network and that working relationship is quite important, and that is something that these collaboration tools hopefully will continue to improve and fill part of that void. We talk on about the management of project resources in a hybrid adaptive workplace. That there's lots of terms that are coming out of the woodwork for these things, but clearly we are likely to not go back to a point in time where as many resources work out of one office as they did before, and that's going to present a number of issues about how you engage with those resources effectively. It's interesting that you know, some of these themes and technologies that we've been talking through around being able to facilitate home working, to be able to manage our stakeholder relationships better, to connect. You know, it's amazing what we now do on Zoom, whereas my recollection is we've been struggling and kicking around video conferencing for the last 10 years and generally failing. So, you know, it's what I suspect we will see is perhaps a redirection of investment into technology that will facilitate this change in the future. And it probably in its own right, in the past, it may have struggled for the appropriate business case to be able to win the investment. But now I think we're likely to see that come through in a far stronger way. Styles of leadership is also, I think, we're likely to see that change as well, be a requirement of both programs and projects going forward for our leaders. I think it's going to take quite a different, obviously, you know, programs and projects go through different stages. I think those stages require different types of skills. and probably working remotely, you know, styles of leadership is going to become more prevalent to be able to effectively sort of manage some of those phases of work, and also the dispersed teams. And then finally, tracking in progress and dependencies. I think, you know, we may have all come from a school where, as you know, there's probably been a lot of formal tracking and metrics that have helped us ensure that we are on track and on time from where we expect to be. I'm not sure that will be quite the case in the future. You know, if we have less time looking into the whites of eyes of our teams and getting to know people, you know, I think it is going to be a far more cerebral, you know, facilitated process. And I think, you know, we're going to have to find ways and mechanisms to really try and engage with people on an individual basis and teams as a whole, probably in a slightly different way than we've done in the past. So I think there are plenty of challenges there for that, but there we are. Jill, if we could just move to the next slide. So this is just a real a summary really from what I've just said, really. This, you know, what might be needed in the future. So in summary, smarter thinking about project delivery and decision making in the changing environment. More emphasis on the effectiveness of leadership roles, in particular the sponsor and business leaders and program managers. Continued adoption of collaboration tools to help aid stakeholder management. Increased importance on facilitation skills and to manage virtual teams and resources remotely. And the development of this more sensing feel about how well we are on progress and where we are against at any one time for any one team. I think that is definitely coming through as an important feature. And I think in summary, and I don't mean this in the sort of project management agile sense, but I think more generically, and more emphasis to employ disciplined agile practices. You know, the ability to change and to adapt to changing circumstances. I think it's something we're going to have to learn to live with, and to so I think that summarizes that. Jill, could you just go to the final slide, please? This really is only a catch-all for the implications of risk management, but I thought I probably didn't want to not mention it in the context of program delivery. But you won't be surprised to see these headings there. You know, and we could do a seminar on risk management and fill the whole time. So it's short shrift to try and cover it in this session, but you'll be aware, I'm sure most of you will be aware, that all the things we've talked about really can fall into these categories of risk. And I think the real challenge for risk management in this changing environment will be how we work at an enterprise level to take that down to the various component parts of the programs and of an organization to make that sort of join up, because clearly what's happened in the last year is larger than any one program can manage. So there has to be that enterprise-wide feed that sort of recognizes where these risks are likely to come from and how we're going to adapt to them in a more nimble way in the future. So I think on risk, that's really all I've got to say. But again, if there's any questions, Jill, I'll hand back to you.
Jill, you muted.
Thank you. I've muted myself. This has been great, and I've really enjoyed this conversation. There's lots of chat going on, and I was trying to read through the chat as well. Are there any kind of questions we've got for Ian before we move on?
It's not so much a question. It's more of an observation, and it's perhaps something Ian and I should have discussed previously. But I was just thinking through some of the like real world examples of what Ian was discussing, and Ian was talking about organisations where they had to keep the lights on during the pandemic. Some organisations had to do more. They had to suddenly ramp up probably what they were going to do anyway, but do, instead of years, they had months to do it, or instead of months, they had weeks to do it. And some of my favorite examples come from supermarkets, who are always going to do more online and home delivery and more click and collect. But to feed the nation, they had to do it immediately and quickly. And these were quite complex programs, new technology, new men in vans, new staff to pick the orders, and it's really impressive how the supermarkets have responded and kept us all fed, basically. But I was just wondering, they now have an expectation. Their senior executives have now seen that more can be delivered much more quickly than they ever thought possible, because what they did, they would never have dreamed was possible. And I'm sure there are lots of organizations like this. And I'm wondering about the pressure on people in programs and projects like that, who are now probably feeling a bit tired and in need of a bit of a rest after what they've done, but are suddenly feeling ongoing pressure to do more and to do it faster, as they've just proven they can do. And I think that's quite an interesting challenge for organizations and project managers and program managers. I just thought I'd chuck that observation in.
I think it's a really valid one, and there's something there for me about having a goal, having a purpose, having a reason to do something that people can engage with, and things can happen quickly. And I think as we go back to the new normal situation, I think we'll lose that real imperative to get something done and get it done quickly. But I think there's also that mental health issue about how do we make sure our staff stay safe and without any kind of mental pressure. So I think it's a really interesting time we're moving into.
Yeah, me too.
Sorry. I was just going to say, it just reminds me there's always a quote, isn't there, you can bring to mind. But it seems to me that it was this one that says, if we have a clear understanding of the why, then we can deal with almost any how. And I think that's what's happened through the pandemic, and has perhaps reinforced the need for leaders to provide some real clarity around why is it we're doing this, whatever it is that you're going to do. Why is it we're doing it? And if you can really come up with that, then people will go above and beyond.
Oops. Right. A year of Zoom calls, and I still get myself on mute when I think I'm meant to be talking. There's still stuff to be learned there. I was wondering, I've no evidence for this. It's just a speculation on my part, but I think one of the reasons why some organizations were able to do more and to do it faster, also within a remote and disparate workforce, is that people working on projects and programs actually had more time for deeper focus, deeper work, more concentrated work, because they were working strange hours because they had to homeschool. They were fitting their work in when it fitted their kind of COVID pattern, and they weren't being as reactive to things that we normally are when we're back in the office. Not responding immediately to the email that comes in, not responding to the ping from the Slack communication, and not attending the meetings that you have no control over scheduling, the partner meetings. You were just, working when you could on what you thought was the best thing to do. And I'm just wondering whether, and communication was more written and more asynchronous than it had been in the workplace. And I was just wondering whether, is that true? And if so, are we going to see more of it in the future world of work?
I think one of the things, Colin, that I picked up on was how people are starting to put in their emails. This is going out at 11 o'clock at night. I don't expect you to answer straight away. It's a recognition that we are working in an asynchronous way, and people have got to readjust. They've got to change the way that they are working. Otherwise, you could be quite easily working, 18-hour days, because there's always somebody that's online. There's always somebody sending you emails. So in a weird way, this may well have forced us to recognise that you can't be reactive in the way that we have been for the last decades. And I think it's true that people have been very reactive in the way that they've managed their time. In the UK in particular, I think in the US, it's been a real scourge. So that's perhaps starting to change, but people have got to take responsibility for trying to shift that change by perhaps putting those things in emails.
Excellent. There's been some great conversations here this afternoon, and I can tell there's a few people who'd just love to keep going. I have put in the chat if anybody wants to just ping any ideas for future conversations they want to have. And it's just been great seeing everybody. I have recorded this, so what I'm hoping to do is just tidy up the recording and put it out for you all. So really good to see you all. Hope you'll come to another future session we run, and I look forward to seeing you in the future. And thank you all the presenters for all the time and effort you've put in putting this together. Thank you for all the attendees for coming along and just listening to us.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Michelle.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you.
Very good. Enjoyed it.
Good. Hear it. Bye.